How long before America recovers from the economic damage that Trump's screwed up response to the coronavirus has caused? Professor Richard Wolff weighs in. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff. He is the Economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books, the most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. democracyatwork.info and rdwolff with 2fs.com. His website's Professor Wolff. Welcome back. We have 30 million people on unemployment. God only knows how many don't qualify for unemployment because they're gig workers or they've been laid off too long. We've got the Washington Post this morning, half of all American families facing utility shutoffs, a third of the people in some states, more than 3 months behind on their bills, a looming eviction crisis. How long is it going to take for America to recover from the damage that Trump has done by the way that he has responded to this pandemic?
Well, I think the best way I can answer that question is with history, as happens so often. I would argue, for most Americans, if you think about it, the entirety of the 20th century in the United States was a reaction to all that had happened in the Great Depression of the 1930s. If you think about it, the war itself was clearly, partly at least, a product of all of that. The role of Roosevelt, the movement to organize unions, vast changes produced in and by the Great Depression. And then the rest of the century, I'm simplifying obviously, but the rest of the century was the determination of the business community and the Republican Party to undo as much of the New Deal, the name of the events of the 1930s, as they could. It started immediately when Roosevelt was dead by getting the limits to the presidential term and the Taft-Hartley bill punching the unions back down compared to what they had achieved. And I tell you this story only because I think we're about to see the same development. I think the consequences of this crash, all three of them, the dot-com in 2000, the subprime mortgage in 2008, and now this devastating one in 2020, the combination of them is shaking the foundations of this society. You can see it reflected in the crazy politics we are now surrounded by. But yes, it is also in the millions of little decisions of people moving from one part of the country to another, losing their credit capacity because they can't pay those utility bills, education that has been interrupted for millions of Americans with unknown long-term consequences. My view, we are at the very beginning of seeing how much damage has been done and how much of our next decades of history will be involved in coping with and fighting out what was done, what wasn't done, and this whole disaster that could have been avoided but wasn't by a regime that seems incapable of even thinking about the long term, let alone dealing with it.
Neil Strauss and, or maybe it's Neil Howe, Strauss and Howe. In any case, these two authors wrote this book. You may be familiar with The Fourth Turning some years ago. This was back in the late 90s. It was a New York Times bestseller. And it posited that, he starts out with Toynbee's quote, when the man who remembers the horrors, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable because, we don't remember the horrors. And he identified that basically, or they identified that as basically an 80-year cycle. That in the 1770s, we had essentially the Great Depression of 1770 that led to the American Revolution and radical economic reforms, throwing out the East India Company and creating a whole new government. In the 1860s, you had the Great Crash of 1856. And on top of the rise of oligarchy in the South, that led right to the Civil War. So you had a crash and a war. That was 80 years later. 80 years after that was the Great Crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. And that, resolved itself after World War II in 1945. We are, from 1945, 75 years out from 45?
Right.
If I'm doing my math in my head right.
Yep,
and so it seems like we're due for another Great Depression followed by a major war. How do we avoid that? First of all, do you give any credence to that theory? And secondly, whether it's a coincidence of history or the function of history, what do we do about it?
Well, I'm not much on these numerical games. I understand what they're trying to say, that there's a pattern here, and I think that's a valuable contribution. But I would analyze it in a somewhat different way. Capitalism as a system, which was the governing system over all those periods you just quoted, has a tendency, that was Thomas Piketty's book a few years ago, has a tendency to produce ever greater inequality, which isn't surprising because every business is run by a handful of people, the owners, the major shareholders, a board of directors, and we shouldn't be surprised that they run that enterprise to serve themselves first and foremost, whatever else they do. And so as a result, they become richer and everybody else doesn't. We're in an extreme form of that now, and I think that happens over 60, 70-year periods. There's a reaction by people. It is undone for a while. The 1930s undid the inequality in the United States, for example, quite dramatically. But as soon as the war was over, as soon as Roosevelt was dead, we began resuming, and especially after 1970, resuming the drive to an inequality, which then reaches such an extreme that there's an explosion. Sometimes it's in the form of a stock market crash. Sometimes it's in the form of massive joining of unions, which is what happened in the 1930s. And I think, yes, we are at that point again. We are at levels of inequality we haven't seen for a century. We have a political polarization that is terrifying, more so literally every day. We have a political out-of-controlledness that is a symptom of a system in decline. If I could play another historical game that isn't so numerical, in the 14th century, another pandemic, this one with fleas on rats, known as the bubonic plague or the Black Death, decimated a huge part of Europe. Europe was then organized as a feudal system, lords and serfs. It never recovered. The decline of feudalism begins then and could not be reversed until the French and American revolutions finished it off, and we have the era of capitalism. How ironic that history might be playing a game on us and bringing us yet another example that if you let the inequality in a community go long enough so that a disease comes along and we can't respond, even though we know how, because we're so busy in our broken, divided society, that this is a way of learning bitterly the lesson that you can't let a system that works this unjustly and unfairly continue, because one way or another it's going to blow up.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It was the smallpox epidemic spreading across Europe in the year, I think the year was 147, that some historians point to as being the thing that took down the Roman Empire.
Absolutely. Because usually what the epidemiologists tell me is that when a society is reasonably healthy, politically, economically, biologically, it can and usually does ward off the viruses, the bacteria, and the other thing. It's usually a measure of a society's breakdown that it can't handle. And that's what we're seeing. We know, Americans know how to produce masks and ventilators and hospital beds. We know it. We didn't do it. The government didn't compensate for the failure of private enterprise to do it. And here we are with a failure we ought to listen closely to.